First, thank you so much for participating in this oral history project. It means a lot to us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Could you please state your name, your occupation, and where you were born?
Okay, my name is Leonard Byron Jones Robinson, otherwise known as Lenny Robinson. I am a musician, educator, all around, hopefully good guy. And I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but grew up in Baltimore. I wound up moving to DC in '85, actually from New York.
How old were you when you moved to Baltimore?
I was in the third grade. So my real musical development was in Baltimore.
I was going to say, do you remember how those first years in Philly, what the neighborhood was like, what was your family like, those kinds of things?
When I was born in Philly, and I wound up, we were living with my aunt in Philadelphia. And I mean, I've been back to that neighborhood, so I have memories, since then. But at 3, I didn't really have that many memories.
Sure.
What I do remember, though, is that it was kind of a tree-lined street. We lived in West Philadelphia, on Jefferson Street near Lancaster. And if there are any Philadelphians there, they'll know exactly where that is. But we moved there in when I was 3, and I remember the neighborhood in Baltimore actually, from that perspective, a lot better.
Oh, you moved to Baltimore in year 3?
Yeah, in the third grade. Sorry, in the third grade.
Talk about what why did your family move?
Okay, let me bit of history. My father, as well as my grandfather, were Pentecostal ministers, and they moved around from church to church. So one of the first churches my father got was a church in Baltimore, and he had. Since then, I stayed in Baltimore, but since then, my parents and my sisters, my younger siblings, moved to Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana, and they're now in Florida. I didn't want to do any of those things.
How did you end up staying in Baltimore?
I was in college at the time. By the time they started moving around to different locations, I was in college, and I didn't want to leave college. I was at Peabody Conservatory, and then I went to Morgan State University.
And when were you born?
1956.
So you moved to, where in Baltimore did your family move to?
We moved on to Liberty Heights Avenue, down near Mondawmin Mall. Folks in Baltimore will know where that is. But West Baltimore would be the section of the city.
And talk about Liberty Avenue. Talk about growing up there. What do you remember about what the community was like? Especially you growing up in church, like what that community was like.
When we lived on Liberty Heights Avenue, the church was downstairs and we lived upstairs, and being a Pentecostal family, and living on top of the church, it was either school or church. We didn't have a television until I was, 12 or 13. My sisters couldn't wear pants. I didn't go to parties. I didn't go to a movie until I was, 19 or 20. So it was a much different way of growing up, because it was very strict. So what I know of the neighborhood is what I could see from my yard, and when we were allowed to venture down to Mondawmin, which was, if I remember correctly, the first indoor mall in the country. But other than that, it was in the house and church, and a very sheltered, siphoned off kind of life.
Did you come to music through the church?
I came to music through the church. I didn't come to jazz through the church.
Well, sure.
But I came to music through the church. Yeah, I played keyboard in my dad's church. I played drums. I strummed on guitar. All of my siblings are in one way or another musicians, either professionally or just being blessed with the gift.
Was your dad a musically gifted or a musician?
No, my dad wasn't. Although he did get me started in music generally, from the standpoint that my first instrument was trumpet, and he actually made me play the trumpet when I was in, I think at the 5th grade. He gave me the trumpet. You will play this trumpet.
Did he say why?
Because he played trumpet a little bit when he was younger, and it was his trumpet. The one that he gave me was the one that he had, and you will play this trumpet. And there's a picture of me in my high school yearbook on stage playing the Haydn, or attempting to play the Haydn concerto, because by that time I had kind of grown tired of the trumpet.
How did you pick up the other instruments?
Well, I played trumpet through high school, but in the 9th grade, I believe it was, I met a guy who at the junior high school I was going to. His name was Billy Lippman, and he played the drums. And during that time, 9th, 10th grade is when you start to discover folks other than the guys that you're with. And he was getting all the girls. I was busting my chops trying to play the trumpet, and I was getting no girls. So it dawned on me that perhaps, playing the drums, and he was just playing like rock and roll kind of stuff. It wasn't anything really involved. I was like, I can do that. So I did. And that's what got me playing the drums. Later, I actually started to get serious about playing percussion. Marimba, timpani, all the other instruments in an orchestra. But what got me playing jazz was I'm still in this sheltered environment where you really can't listen to other music other than gospel music, And I was somewhat of a rebel, so I had a little radio in my bedroom that I would sneak and listen to stations other than the gospel radio stations. And one night I heard, I heard some music. And I didn't know it at the time. I remember the song, but I didn't know it at the time. But what I was hearing was a Max Roach Clifford Brown record. And I couldn't figure out what Max was doing. I just couldn't, I'm playing my little rock and roll stuff, and I could do that. But it was like I had no idea what that was. So that's what kind of got me going on that journey.
Do you remember what radio station that was?
Ooh, no.
Fair enough. So I'm curious, being a young person who's still going to school, what are your classmates listening to? What? Sure, you start rebelling listening to jazz radio in your bedroom, but what were your classmates listening to? What was the sound in the halls?
Oh, I don't know about in the halls, and I don't really know about at the parties and what they were listening, because I was sheltered from that. There's a lot of music from my childhood that everyone that's my age knows that I don't know. I mean, I've heard it kind of after the fact.
Yeah.
And when I hear it, it's like, yeah, I've heard that before. But for them, music has this power where it can transport you. Like if you heard a specific song in a specific place that had some meaning, and you hear that song years later, you can immediately go back to that. And so there's all these songs that they have that does that for them, that it doesn't do it for me, because I didn't hear it until later.
But you said you were playing like little rock and roll stuff.
Yeah, well, playing the beats. I wasn't playing in any bands. I wasn't doing anything like that, but I could play the beats. And by that time, there were some like little school things that were going on in the auditorium, and I do that kind of stuff for my ulterior motive reasons. But in terms of really being involved in the culture of the neighborhood, I still wasn't quite there yet, because I hadn't really kind of broken away from my home.
So you hear Max Roach and Clifford Brown on the radio.
Right.
And you were 14, 15?
Something like
maybe?
That. Maybe a little bit younger than that, 13.
13? What does that do to you?
It makes me being me, it makes me kind of want to seek some of that out. And the first person I went to was the guy that kind of got me started, which is Billy Lippman. He had no clue. And then I went to my the music teacher at the school, And he kind of pointed me in a direction. He started kind of just showing me stuff. He started just kind of letting me know who these people were and what that music was with his really limited knowledge. And it wasn't until I kind of decided to reach out and find some other folks that were kind of doing what I was doing. And by that time, I had started to venture out. My parents had started to loosen up. You know, my sisters could wear pants now. You know, we had a TV. So things were loosening up, and I was able to interact with some other folks that were doing what I had an interest in, but still didn't know what it was.
So this is about 1970, maybe?
Something like that, yeah.
I was wondering, you know, you're in Baltimore in 1968. Do you remember, how that changed?
Oh, I
city,
remember.
how that changed
I
your
remember
area?
exactly where I was when I heard that Martin Luther King died. I was in the gym at Pimlico Junior High School. I know exactly where I was, and that had it had a profound effect on the world in general, but it had in the black community it had a deeper effect, and in the religious black community there was an immediate sense of not just the loss in terms of his activism, but his loss in terms of his spirituality and the human side of him, and in terms of being a spreader of the gospel and of the world. So there was a big hole there. I definitely remember that, and I was also confused about the aftermath. I was confused about the aftermath. You know, the riots and the fires and all that stuff. That really confused me at that time.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I just didn't understand why it happened. You know, I didn't understand why. Remember, I'm like 15, 16. I'm not
Sure.
really involved in the culture. But I didn't understand why things were being destroyed because this man of peace was killed. I didn't get the connection to those two things.
Was where you grew up and lived in Baltimore, was it predominantly black? Was it?
It was
mixed?
predominantly black.
Yeah.
It wasn't a poor rundown slum.
Sure.
It wasn't that. It was a middle class, you know, a predominantly black middle class neighborhood that was in the process. Still, it was like the last vestiges of it changing over from being a primarily Jewish neighborhood to a primarily black neighborhood. I mean, we had I forget what you call those things on the door frames.
I know it. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
what you're talking
we
about.
had those things like with little like excerpts from Torah, I believe is what's in there.
Yeah.
But we had those on our door frame in our house. You know, and so did a lot of other families in that neighborhood. So it was evidence of the changeover.
But in that neighborhood didn't react as explosively, shall we say, to
No. All of the explosiveness happened kind of. It was aimed towards those areas where, from what I could gather at the time, which I now have a clearer idea of, it was aimed at businesses more than anything else.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted to get back at the man.
Did that have an impact on your father, his church?
Not really, other than
Yeah.
other than making for that, for us and for those that are in that Pentecostal realm, that is stuff. I mean, other than the fact that it happened as a result of Dr. King's death, what was happening was those people in the world.
Yeah.
And so other than it being more evidence of them being on the right track, That's the only thing. I mean, there was, of course, there was sadness. There was, this is a terrible thing, so on and so forth. But in terms of having any real change in terms of what happened in the church, no.
What's that neighborhood like now?
Well, by that time, we weren't living above the church. By that time, he had been transferred to another church in the area. We were actually living in a house, not too far from where it was, but not in that same like church house situation. And that neighborhood now it's always been a nice neighborhood. It's gone down a little bit, and now it's kind of going back. I go over there periodically if I'm doing a gig in Baltimore. It's like I'm kind of in that area. I just kind of drive through to see what happens. I mean, the high school that I graduated from is a block and a half from my house. Well, what was my house then?
Fair enough. So you hear this Max Roach song on the radio? Do you join did your school have a jazz band? Like how you talked about, talking with people trying to understand what this thing was. So how did you?
Well, when I was
what was the
when that happened, I was in junior high school. My last year of junior high school. And I really didn't get very much information from either my peers or my music teacher at the time. But I was very lucky to be in the first class of a brand new high school in Baltimore called Walbrook High School. And, the word woke kind of gets thrown around these days. Well, it was probably the most woke high school in Baltimore.
It was progressive.
It was progressive, but it was progressive with a very black conscious viewpoint. So all the teachers were black, all the administrators were black, all the students were black. There may have been 2 or 3 white guys that went there, but for 99% of the people were black. And not only were they black, but they were black progressives. So I had some experiences that I know most other people have never had. For instance, we had the complete Sun Ra Orchestra for a full school assembly.
Oh my God.
Complete with the dancing girls painted in gold and the whole thing.
I was gonna say Max Roach is here, and then you hear that music.
Well, there's that, but by that time, that happened probably when I was a junior. So by that time, I'd had some more experience and had been exposed to in that environment. I got exposed to a lot very quickly, and not only did I get exposed to a lot very quickly, but I got exposed to people, to resources to gain more knowledge. You could give me, knowledge in terms of whichever direction I want to go in. But the fact that the school was open to do that. It's also where I met some of my first lifelong musical friends. I was in a Jimi Hendrix. Well, I went through my Jimi Hendrix phase, and we had a trio with Donald Griffin and Tony Bunn. Donald Griffin had a brother named Bubby. Oh, he has a brother named Bubby. And Bubby took Smokey Robinson's place when Smokey left the Miracles. And Donald became the guitar player with the Miracles. But at the time, he was really into Jimi Hendrix. Tony Bunn has played with a bunch of folks. He was playing, when we graduated high school, he went to Europe to play with Mike Urbaniak. And he's probably one of the best electric bass players that I've come across. But anyway, so we had a trio in high school at the time. And there was a talent show. And we won the talent show because we did Jimi Hendrix's version of the Star Spangled Banner, complete with the lighter fluid. Set the guitar on fire. We won.
Talk about a progressive black environment.
But that's where first early formative kind of musically development years were spent was in that space, and I'm so grateful that I had that experience, because it opened me up at an age when most kids come under the tutelage of people that are kind of say, you need to do it this way, and this was it's all the same, it's all music, which I carry to this day. It's all music. Doesn't matter, what kind of music it is. What I try to do is be true to whatever that music is. So
I'm just curious. I want to go back and talk about that a little. But what was the high school's name?
Walbrook.
Walbrook. Being at Walbrook High School, you're in this unique, not just musical environment for you, but academic, intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
philosophical. How did being in that kind of educational environment, independent of music, affect you as a young person, and maybe affect you as a musician, being in that kind of intellectual space that was?
I think that's where I get my intellectual curiosity from. I try not to do things surface level. I'm always asking why. Why is that? Well, why did he think that way? Well, so for me, the why question is always, there.
Do you remember what the curriculum was like?
Oh, it was academically rigorous. I don't remember exactly what the curriculum was like, but I remember that my band director, his name was Miguel Roy, wasn't a jazz guy, but he was a music guy, and he's a guy that kind of instilled in all of us a reverence for music that kind of took us beyond just like playing the black dots on the white piece of paper. So that's what I remember. I remember a science teacher that taught science in a way that made you, if you hadn't already made up your mind to do something else, to be a scientist. So it was a wonderfully rich, rewarding high school experience that I'm not saying it's never happened. I'm sure in every city there's a school that's similar to that. Not in every city, but in a lot of major cities, there's a school that's similar, that has a similar group of educators there to shape the students that come through. But I was lucky enough to be in one of them.
So you played trumpet?
I'm still playing trumpet.
Junior high.
I'm still
playing.
I'm still playing trumpet. I'm not playing trumpet well, but I'm still playing trumpet. But my focus started to shift away from trumpet as my primary instrument towards drum initially, and then percussion. After that, and it was by tapping into different resources, I found a great teacher. His name was Chuck Memphis. He was the principal percussion with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra and was on staff at Peabody Conservatory. And that's how I wound up there. And I, again, just serendipitously, the right person at the right time.
So you found him while you were still in high school?
I found him before I graduated as a senior.
How did you two connect?
I don't even. Oh, I do know now. I remember. By this time, I'm in high school. I'm kind of away from my parents. Kind of in terms of that clamp down, and they weren't as tight anyway in terms of clamping us down. So there was some freedom. So I started interacting with other musicians. One of them was a good friend of mine. His name is George Gray, and he was actually studying with Chuck Memphis at the time. And he says, "You need to get with this guy," and that's how that happened.
What was the attraction for you of the drums as opposed to the trumpet? I mean, I know the trumpet was foisted upon you, but
I guess it's one of those things where you don't choose it; it chooses you. And like I said, it started out as just a drum, but it's the whole percussion thing. Just kind of, it just felt right. And it wasn't because trumpet was forced on me. I mean, I still, to this day, have a trumpet and pull it out and we'll play some notes for the 5 minutes that my chops will last. But because I love all instruments, and as a result of that, I actually can play. As an educator, I have to be able to play, all of those instruments to be able to teach all those instruments. So, but the percussion just kind of reached out and grabbed me, and I knew that was the area that I was supposed to be in.
And you weren't even defining yourself really as a jazz musician.
No.
At that point.
No. Jazz was just one of the things I was interested in, because I grew up when I finally started to get into music other than the gospel music, and the music that I heard on the radio from time to time. I was into fusion. I was a fusion guy, and fusion. Actually, before that, I was kind of like a rock and progressive rock kind of guy. I mean, I'm one of the few. I don't know few, but I'm one of not a whole lot of black guys that listen to Grand Funk Railroad. So my range of musical taste was wider to begin with. So I try not to define music into genres or categories or whatever it is. I'm forced to, just based on the market and the industry, to have those, have those words at the ready if I have to use them for someone who maybe isn't quite as open or expansive in there.
Yeah.
But I try not to do that.
So you find Chuck Memphis.
Yeah.
What, and right before had you settled on Peabody? How did you settle on Peabody in music and that
Well, I
as
settled
higher
on
education?
I settled on Peabody because he taught at Peabody. And I lasted there 1 year. No, not because I couldn't do it, but because it was just so ridiculously expensive. And then I found out he got a position as adjunct faculty at Morgan State. It was like, So, because I wasn't at Peabody necessarily for the musical education, although it was great. The attraction was the fact that he was kind of a unicorn at the time. And what I mean by that is he's an extremely accomplished classical percussionist that also liked jazz and also liked all this other music, and had studied it and had. I mean, I still have his book that's got examples and excerpts in like this really wide range of musics. Typically, you'll get a book that's like the snare drum book of classic etudes or whatever, or then you'll have another book that's based on Latin rhythms, or you'll have another book that's based on how to approach swing rhythm. But he has a book that has all that stuff in it, and he was teaching me all that stuff at an age where I was just soaking it all in. So that was my purpose for being there, is to have that resource. And when he became an adjunct over at Morgan, I could do it for significantly less money. That's where I went. Now, when I went to Morgan, I changed from performance to education. Just, how, my mom, gotta have something to fall back on, all those kinds of things. But it didn't matter to me. That part didn't matter to me because I still had my resource. I had my reason. My reason for being there was still there. So that's how that came about.
What was the name of the book that you're talking
about? It's way out of print. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore for all intents and purposes. He passed away about 8 years ago, and I know his wife probably has some copies of it, but it's not on the market. I got a copy, but
But what's it called?
I don't even remember what don't even know if I still have the cover to it. I don't remember what he actually called it. I really don't.
I mean, you talk about following him and some of his impact. Talk about what his instruction was like what you're learning from him.
Well, like I said, it was everything from correct snare drum technique, classic and progressive classical snare drum etudes and the like. It was timpani technique and etudes. It was mallet techniques and etudes. It was drum set playing from a swing standpoint. It was drum set playing from a Latin standpoint. It was approach to what are known as kind of hybrid situations, where you have a bunch of different, it might have a bass drum, some tom toms, a xylophone, and a gong, and there would be a piece written for that. And you have to set it up and do all those things. So it was the full range of all of those things at a very high level. He was a unicorn. He was a true unicorn. So that was the nature of study. And he'd sit there. He was one of those guys. He reminded me. I don't know if you remember the original Batman TV show.
Adam West.
Huh?
Adam West.
Yeah. Remember the penguin with the long, he had one of those. Yeah, he had one of those. He'd sit there and, he'd have his cigarette with the long thing, and he'd show me this, and, that would be our lesson, while he's smoking his cigarettes. And
Are you performing or playing or gigging while you're at Morgan State?
I started to, yeah. That's when I first started doing some gigs.
Talk about your first gigs.
My actual first gig, how old was I? 15? I thought I knew what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. But I met a guitar player. His name was Jimmy Bethia, really interesting guy. And for some reason, he took a liking to me. I'm still just kind of getting going. And he had a gig, and he asked me, he called me to do the gig. I was 15. I made $80. I had to drive to New Jersey to get it, but the gig was in New Jersey. But I made $80 on my first gig when I was 15. But after that, I started working around Baltimore a little bit, and doing different and various things, mainly jazz and kind of funk kind of things. I did my very first European tour when I was 20. Because one of the things that occurred while I was doing these various and sundry gigs was I got in touch with, or was reached out by, from a group that did, it's called Promote Your Experience, and what they did was they kind of chronicled black music from slavery up until what was then the present. This would have been 79, something like that, 78. So it was a theatrical group. They had the costume changes. And somehow, I still don't know how this happened, somehow they managed to get a tour of Europe doing all the major festivals. Montreux, Umbria, North Sea. Right? I don't know how it happened. Again, it's one of those things, I look back on my life, and there's all these things that have happened, kind of the right things at the right time. So, I guess being the son of two preachers, the son and grandson of two preachers, it doesn't hurt. But that was an amazing experience.
I was going to say, what do you remember about that first tour?
What don't I remember? Our first stop was Montreux. And we went...
No pressure.
No. Well, for me, it wasn't. I didn't know. I didn't know. I mean, I could see there was something, but I didn't really have. Although I very quickly found out. And when I didn't really know what Montreux was. Okay, so we went on at Montreux, I'm trying to remember. It wasn't what we played wasn't the important part of the Montreux experience. I don't remember what stage we did play on the main stage. I don't remember who opened or whether we opened. I don't even remember that part. But I do remember that as a result, and I'm finding out after the fact. But because folks didn't know who I was, it was like, oh, he's the new guy, and so somebody needed a drummer. And that somebody was Etta James. So, in my very limited knowledge, first of all, I thought it was Etta Jones. Quite familiar with Etta Jones. Oh no, Etta James. I know nothing of Etta James's music. Okay? So, I get a call from her music director. Come, Etta needs a drummer. Can you make the gig? Yeah, I can make the gig. Rehearsals at whatever time. I go to rehearsal. They count off. He gives me some music to count off the piece. Some heavy hitting rock and roll-ish kind of thing. And I play it. I'm still playing my little jazzy thing. I mean, I know how to play the beats, but there's a difference between knowing how to play the beats and having that sound. There's a sound that has to happen. I didn't have that sound yet. So we did the first one, and it's kind of an awkward silence at the end. He says, okay, well, let's try this other one. And he pulls it out, and we play it, and he says, okay, let's take 5. And he walks over and he gives me $100 and says, no, this isn't going to work. First lesson. Know your artist. Know your artist. But for me, it was a discovery of a hole in my playing. It was like, I wanted to do all, and like I said, I could play the beats, but it's having the sound. I didn't have the experience of playing really in that environment and knowing what you had to do to make that work. So, at the end of the tour, when I came back, I immediately joined a funk band. So I could learn how to hit the drums, how to establish a groove that's worthy of people wanting to get up and dance, and then keeping them there. All right, so that was something that I hadn't had the experience in doing. I'd been playing all this fusion stuff and kind of my ding stuff, and all my classical stuff, but that was an area that needed to get filled, and I discovered that. Okay, that was the first thing. The second thing actually had, in some ways, a bigger impact on me. When we went to North Sea, we got there the day before. And we're at the hotel. At that time, everyone's staying at the same hotel at the North Sea Festival. And by this time, I kind of am realizing that this is some real stuff, all right? So I get to the North Sea, and I'm walking around the hotel, and I see Ella Fitzgerald. And she's in a wheelchair. She was sick at this time. This is, 78 somewhere. She was sick. And she had her nurse pulling her pin. And so I'm like, oh, man, Ella, I felt bad. Later that night, I found out that we were going to be playing the next day, opening for Ella Fitzgerald. And I'm immediately both elated, I'm happy, and then it's like, oh, wait a minute, she's sick. Oh, man. So I'm in kind of this conflicted kind of mode. So the next day, we get there, and it turns out we were actually the second opening act. The first opening act was the Don Ellis Big Band, who I knew nothing of. And so I'm sitting there looking at, these, the band playing, 17/8, all the crazy stuff that Don Ellis did. And then we went out and we did our thing, and very well received. And now I'm back in the wings, waiting for Ella. Sidebar. Keter was playing. I didn't know Keter at the time, had no idea that I would meet Keter, but Keter was he remembered that. He was playing with Ella. He was playing with Ella. we talked about that much later because I remembered that gig. But anyway, so Ella comes down. She's in her wheelchair, and she's sick. I mean, literally, she just kind of slumped in the wheelchair. So they get set up, and they introduce her. They wheel her out to like the edge of the wing of the stage, and they introduce her, and she gets out of her wheelchair. And as soon as the lights hit her, she's not sick anymore. And so I'm back here, and remember, for me, I've been playing music and doing what I've been doing, but I've never been around that. And the transformation would, for me, just kind of messed me up. Because she went from being sick to not being sick and performed like nothing was wrong. Energy, 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 energy. Encore, second encore, bouquet of flowers. See you later. She comes back, and as soon as she's in the wings, she's in her wheelchair and she's sick again. And that actually had a more profound thing on me, because I kind of related it to the whole spiritual thing with my upbringing and the spirituality that's involved, that's in this music. It's in all music, but especially this music we tend to call jazz. Because it's not a question of reinterpreting something someone else has done, which is what classical music is. And there's a bunch of classical musicians that are masters at reinterpreting what's there. But you can't, but you're still dealing with what's there. What this music is all about is creating in the moment. And there's a commitment, there's a level of vulnerability, there's a passion, there's a humanity that's in that doesn't occur. I haven't heard it occur in any other musics, and I've heard a bunch of musics around the world. I haven't heard that occur in any other music, and it's that spiritual nature of this music that was the first time I really saw that, and it was like, whoa, that the music and the therapeutic nature. That music is actually keeping her alive. Doing this music is actually keeping her alive. So those are the two main things that I remember from that tour, and both of them have stuck to me with me until this day.
I mean, it's a sidebar on my part. Tony Bennett been suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's, but as soon as his piano player starts playing the classic songs,
Bing! He's there.
He's Tony.
Roy Haynes, same way. Roy Haynes, I mean, he hasn't been playing recently, but the last time I saw him, I tried to see him a lot.
I mean, he was still playing at 90, whatever.
Yeah. And his short-term memory is pretty much gone. But he can remember stuff from back in the day, and when he sits down at the drums, as soon as they start playing, that's there. It's there. So it's
embedded at the level of DNA.
Absolutely.
So after you graduate from Morgan State, I assume you graduate from Morgan State. When do you graduate?
79.
What do you do after you graduate?
I took a job. I was teaching at a music store, and by this time I'm gigging. I'm starting to get busy around the city, but it's still Baltimore. There's not a whole lot there.
You're gigging in Baltimore?
Yeah, I'm gigging in Baltimore. There's not a whole lot there. I was teaching at a music store in a mall, not Montgomery Mall. I'm teaching at a store in a mall, and another trumpet teacher came in as a teacher as well, and he let me know. He says, "Man, I'm thinking about joining the Army." I said, "What? Joining the Army?" He said, "Yeah. They got a trumpet spot in New York." Really? And it turned out they also had a percussion spot in New York. Audition, got the gig. You had to go to basic training and all that stuff. But we're stationed at Fort Hamilton, which is right underneath the Verrazano Bridge in Brooklyn. Again, just
Nice work if you can get it.
well, it's just it happened at exactly the right time. It was exactly what I needed at exactly the right time, because being in New York at that time, I met a large number of folks that are still my friends, that are household names in music, in jazz especially, but in some cases just in music, and boom, there it is. It just happened that way.
I was gonna say, talk about arriving in New York at that time. I mean, I don't want to lead the witness, but obviously on the Lower East Side you have that whole loft thing, and Sam Rivers and Ornette and
There was
all those
well
guys.
that was kind of winding down by the time I got there. But there was this is a time when Marsalis was and that whole crew was, the Young Lions was going, and Joey Calderazzo. I'll give you kind of put things in perspective. Joey Calderazzo, Branford's piano player now. I met Joey. Joey's probably 20 years younger than me, 18 years younger than me, somewhere in there. Yeah, something like that. He's in his 40s now. But he was a teenager then. And him and I and his friend, the bass player, I forget the bass player's name, used to jam at the Army barracks, sometime. But that whole era of like the Young Lions was in play then. And there was a place in Manhattan on West Grand called the 55 Grand. Not the 55 Grand that's on Christopher Street in the Village, but this is a different one on West Grand. And it was the hangout. I mean, of all the guys, I got to play with Jocko there. I got to play with a whole bunch of folks. I actually had my band play there. It got written up in The Voice, which I'm still in the Army. I'm still in the Army. We're not supposed to do that. At least not back then. I mean, it's kind of loosened up now, but back then you weren't supposed to do outside gigs. But as a result of this trumpet player saying, yeah, I think I'm going to join the Army and play trumpet, and that just kind of like boom, because I didn't that wasn't anywhere on my radar.
And this was the Army's just a generic, like an orchestra, or was it specifically a jazz band?
It was what they called a field band that does everything. It had a concert band, it had a show band, it had a big band. It would put combos together to do gigs at the officers' clubs, and you did everything. You did everything.
I can talk more about what Brooklyn was like and what was like gigging around New York at that time.
Well, I wasn't in. I don't know how to say that. I wasn't in Brooklyn. I was in Bay Ridge. All right. I don't know how much you know about New York, but Bay Ridge is. Let's see. Upper 16th Street compared to, I don't know, Anacostia. So Bay Ridge would be the upper 16th Street side of that equation. But I knew folks in Brooklyn. When I got out of the Army, I only did one tour because I didn't go there to join the Army. I went there to have Uncle Sam pay for me to move to New York.
Play jazz.
Huh?
And play jazz.
And be a musician.
Yeah.
Again, I don't categorize the music. And be a musician, because the one thing that people forget about New York sometimes, because especially folks that are into jazz, is they forget that not only is it the capital pretty much for jazz, but it's also a capital for a lot of other kinds of music.
Salsa, samba.
Salsa, theater, classical, polkas, country western. It's got whatever kind of music you want in New York, you can find it, and there's a niche for it. All right. There are people that only play salsa and make a wonderful living. There are people that only play, Brazilian music and make a great living. There are people that play only jazz and make a great living. And then there's those people that do some of all of those things. I wanted to be that guy that did some of all those things, because it was all music to me. I remember there was a time I was playing at a club in Queens in which I don't speak any Spanish, and no one in the club spoke any English. Okay? And I was subbing for a friend of mine, and I was able to walk in and play that music because I had enough knowledge of the rhythms that were there. I didn't know the songs, but I knew the rhythms because Chuck Memphis. All right? And so he would look at me, he'd say cumbia and count it off, rumba and count it off, salsa and count it off. And I would be able to do that because I knew what I learned by doing that, because it's all music for me.
I'm just curious, at that time hip hop is developing
in Harlem,
in the Bronx,
yeah. I wasn't a part of it. I was not a part of it.
But were you aware of it?
I was aware of it. I had no interest in it.
Just curious. What do you do when you get out of the Army?
I got out of the Army. I played a bunch in New York, and then I was faced with a dilemma because now we're in the mid-'80s, and New York's the wild, wild west. Literally people getting shot on the corners and drive-bys and blah, 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 blah. And my son was born. And it was like, not a good time to raise a son. Because at that time, I was doing some gigs, but I wasn't making a ton of money. It was like, okay, what are we going to do? So me and my wife, we looked at, okay, so where could we move that it's as close to New York in terms of resources and offerings as possible? And this was the only logical place. Education institutions, a city full of folks of all different stripes, countries of origin. It's an international city. There's airports. There's all the things that are there.
It's funky.
It's
funky.
It's funky too. Yeah. Not quite in the New York City subway kind of funky, but funky. Yeah, it's got a vibe.
The Chocolate City funky.
Yeah. Well, it was Chocolate City then.
Well, sure.
But yeah, this was the only place that made sense, and I'm glad I did, because it's given me an additional perspective. Which is and a lot of people have come to this conclusion, but I think moving here brought me to this conclusion as well. You don't have to live in New York. You don't have to live in New York. Let me rephrase that. If you want to be a jazz musician, you don't have to live in New York forever. You do have to live in New York for a certain period of time, because that's the only real way you'll get an idea of where the bar is. But you don't have to live there forever. And B, New York isn't the only place that's got great musicians. When I first moved here, I didn't have a gig. I didn't know anything about DC. My wife got a job. But I went down to the One Step Down and met Lawrence Wheatley and sat in a few times. Eventually, I got the call to do that Saturday, Sunday workshop that he did down at the One Step Down. And that opened me up to a lot of other things. People, oh, who's the new guy? And that's how that happened. It's also how I don't know if you knew this or not, but it's also how I met Dave Grohl.
Say more.
All right, so Dave's mom, Virginia,
was a public school teacher.
Yeah, but in Arlington, I think. Yeah, but she would come down to the One Step on Sundays and bring Dave. He's like, I don't know, 13, 15, 14, 15 years old or something. And he's just starting to get into drums. And she brought him, she would bring him down to come hang out and listen to some jazz. And, we would talk. And she let me know that he was into drums. And she wanted me to give him a lesson. So I went to their house to give him a lesson. So I get to the house, I go down to the basement, his drums are set up, and I kind of walk over to the drums and tap on them just to see, how are they tuned, what's the placement, all that kind of stuff, what kind of cymbals, blah, blah, blah. I sit down and play a little bit, and then I say, okay, cool. So let's see what you're working on. And he sat down at the drums and proceeded to beat the crap out of the drum. I mean, he beat the crap out of the drum. And I sat and I listened, and when he finished, I said, interesting. I said, you do realize you're holding your sticks backwards, right? Because I'm coming from this, technique, proper way of playing the instrument kind of space, and he wasn't. He wasn't. But we had a really interesting conversation about why you play music. What's the intent to play? What's the passion? Because he was obviously passionate about doing what he was doing. He wasn't trying to be something that he wasn't to impress me. He was being himself and just letting it, this is what I do. This is who I am. All right. And so we had a conversation about that. And but at the end of the day, he says, I can't afford to be a real drummer. So we only did one lesson. But apparently it's stuck in his brain because he wrote about me in his book.
Note to self: read book. I mean, I've seen Dave a few times, but I've only seen him drum once. He was at the 930 Club and he was playing a bunch of Bad Brain songs. I was 6 people from the front.
Oh,
I felt it in my chest cavity.
Yeah.
I think he is. No, for rock and roll, he's probably the best drummer I've ever seen.
I didn't follow his career. But from what I can see, he's very good at what he does.
Yes.
He's very good at what he does. And he's also not a bad rock and roll guitar player. So, hey,
He's also said he plays the guitar like he plays the drums. Or like...
Probably.
He thinks of it like a drum kit.
I can see that.
What was Lawrence Wheatley's workshop on the Saturdays and Sundays?
Oh, he called it a workshop. It was a jam session.
Okay.
It was a jam session. But it was a jam session in which he brought his own tunes in. So it wasn't just come in, just walk in and just call a tune that you want to play. It's like, okay, yeah, it's a jam session, but we're jamming on this song. So that's what made it a workshop. It wasn't just an open, free for all kind of jam session. There was some education going on as well.
Where did you move to when you moved to DC?
Originally, when we first got here, we didn't have a place, so we stayed with, interestingly enough, the same aunt that I lived with my parents in Philadelphia with.
She moved to DC.
She's in Virginia. But then we moved to Silver Spring, and we've been in Silver Spring pretty much ever since.
What do you remember about Silver Spring and about where this is like 85, 86?
This would have been 85, yeah, we moved here in 85, I think we moved to Silver Spring in 86, yeah.
What do you remember about Silver Spring and just DC in general? What were the neighborhoods like? What was the city like?
Well, I knew nothing about DC other than to get from point A to point B and maybe look as much as I could while I was driving to get there. The thing that intrigued us about Silver Spring was the diversity. And we'd been living in New York for 5 years, 6 years at that point. It was like, you know what? I kind of like trees and grass. So hence the Silver Spring, and that worked out. But my wife, she always has these figures and does some research. At the time she researched, Silver Spring there were 141 different languages spoken in Silver Spring at that time. So for me, that was great. I like that kind of diversity. I like that kind of offering of multiple cultures. So.
When you first started playing at the One Step Down, who are you meeting? What musicians are you meeting? And
this would have been at the same time that on Monday nights, Steve Novosel and Reuben Brown did the Monday nights. So I would go down to hear them. But different folks would come in. Let's see. A lot of the folks that came in at that time aren't still here because it was a lot of the older guys. The saxophone player was Maurice Robertson, who's transitioned. It was just the beginning of the new crop of younger musicians. I think I met Antonio there, Antonio Parker. He first started coming out, going there. Man, my mind is drawing a blank now. But different of the younger guys, were there. I think Thad Wilson came in a couple times. Early Paul Carr, because they were at Howard, and the One Step was like the weekend get a chance to play with somebody other than the Howard folks. So that's where that was.
Where else were you playing besides the One Step?
There weren't a lot of places then. There was Mr. Wise on Rhode Island Avenue. A little later on, there was a place called Les Nices on Upper 14th Street, like across from the bus depot. But there weren't a lot of places. But I was doing regular corporate, gigs, office parties and those kind of things.
Sure.
And every now and then I would get called to play at the One Step on the weekend for whatever artist came in. I mean, I got a chance to play with some cool people. Yeah, I played with Dewey Redman. I played with Fathead, Sonny Fortune. Art Farmer. That's all I can remember right now. I'm sure I'm forgetting some others, but.
What kind of band? For your corporate gigs? What kind of cats were you?
Oh, I don't know. Whoever called
could.
me. Whoever called me. All we're doing is playing music to be ignored by.
Fair enough. How did, as you spent more time in DC, did more places open up? How did the
Well,
gig
this
landscape
is the
change?
time. This is during the time when the original Twins opened up.
On Connecticut?
No, Colorado and
Colorado.
Longfellow. And by this time, the One Step was kind of going away. It had gone through, the original owner, Joe Cohen, passed, and it was sold to someone else, and they tried to keep it as a jazz club for a while, but it didn't make it. It's a Subway sandwich shop now, if I remember correctly. But the original Twins opened up, and Mozzie and Kelly were bringing some folks down from New York. So I got a chance to play with a bunch of folks there. I got a chance to play with Ronnie Matthews, John Hicks, a lot of piano players. What tenor players came down? Ron Blake, Don Braden, Mark Carey came over, a bunch of folks. It was like, Twins was like the place for a long while. Then HR 57 opened up. What else? And of course, Blues Alley was always in the background. Not in the background, but there. You know, it's not in the background at all. But it was always there. So yes, and I started as I was here for longer and longer amounts of time. You know, your name gets around. I started getting more and more gigs, and I was going out too. I was still kind of with my New York connection, so I was still going out with Vanessa Rubin. Then I got the gig with Stanley Turrentine, and then when Stanley passed, I was working with Marlena Shaw. Went out for several tours with Lou Donaldson. Played with Ahmad Jamal for a minute. So, you know, between those things have been moving.
Can you talk about touring with Stanley and Lou Donaldson and what those bands were like?
Okay. Let's start with, I'll tell you the Lou Donaldson story. So, I've lived in New York a couple times. I mean, obviously, there was a time when I was in the Army, but I've gone back, you know, a couple times just because things were kind of dying down. It's like I need to get back in the thing. So I moved back to New York in January of '99, I believe it was, and I'm going around letting everybody know I'm back in town. I went down to the Vanguard. Lou Donaldson was playing at the Vanguard. I didn't know Lou. I went down because Ben Riley was playing drums, who I didn't know. I went down to Vanguard. We're back in the kitchen in the Vanguard, and Ben introduces me to Lou, and Lou is like, man, nice to meet you. Wish I'd met you earlier. And the reason why he said that is because he was going to be there for 2 weeks, but Ben could only do the first week. I said, no problem. Gave him my card. You know, I'm here. It'll come back around. He says, I'm sorry. I wish I'd known you. I could have used you next week, but I already got somebody. I said, no problem. Give him my card. Next Tuesday, I go down. It's a blizzard in New York. It's like, you know, a foot of snow on the ground, 1.5 feet of snow on the ground. I go down. I walk and go down the steps in Vanguard. Dr. Lonnie's playing organ. Peter Bernstein's playing guitar. Lou's playing the saxophone, and there's no drums on stage. So I sit down. At the end of the set, Lou says, you got your drums with you tonight? I said, no, but I can have them tomorrow night. And he did something I didn't think he would do. He said, he looked at Lonnie. He said, Lonnie, should I give this boy a chance? He had just met me Friday, right? He just met me Friday. Should I give this boy a chance? And Lonnie says, hey, it's your gig. So Lou looks at me. You know, he has a high-pitched voice. He looks at me and says, tomorrow night, 9:30. So next night I go down, take my drums, get set up. We play the first set. Doesn't say anything to me. Okay. Play the second set. He doesn't say anything to me. So I get my courage up and say, Lou, so what's the deal? Tomorrow night, 9:30. So that was a great week. You know, it was a great week. In fact, on that Sunday, you know, Lou and George Benson are really close friends, and Lonnie and George are really close friends. George came in, and it was really funny because he came in, and he wanted to sit in, but he had this big old bandage on this finger, right? And Peter gave him his guitar, and he proceeded to play with this finger bandaged up, like a real huge bandage. He couldn't play with it. He proceeded to play with these 3 fingers and kill on Peter's guitar, just kill. What I didn't know was, I didn't know something then, but I found out later that week. Later the next week, Billy Hart was playing at Sweet Basil's. Sweet Basil's was still open in New York. And I walk in Sweet Basil's, and Billy Hart is standing talking to Max Roach, who I hadn't met yet. So I go up, hey man, how you doing, blah, blah, blah. You know Max? He introduces me to Max. Max says, hey man, how you doing? He says, wait a minute. Were you playing at the Vanguard last week? I said, yeah. He says, oh man, you sound good. Max Roach said I sound good. And remember, that's what started me. He's what started me on this journey to begin with. You know, it's just it's been a good life.
Talk about a right place, right
Yeah,
time.
the right place, right time.
I'm curious, how did you moved to DC in '86? You spent your couple time in New York. How is DC changing? Kind of, as we approach the new millennium.
Oh, you mean how was it changing as we approached the new?
As we approach the year 2000, yeah.
Right. Okay. I was beginning to see the beginnings of the gentrification. I was beginning to see the effects of that in terms of, you know, when people get displaced, the majority of them have some place else to go to, but there's a certain group that don't. And there was a dramatic increase over the course of time of folks that were, you know, living on the street, which I'm sure there was a bit of that always, but never to the extent that I was starting to see. And because I didn't live in the city, there were cultural demographic things that I just wasn't aware of that also kind of, I'm sure, exacerbated that. Yes, that's the word. But I started to see that. I also started to see more smaller places offering jazz, not necessarily jazz performance venues, but more smaller places just offering jazz, restaurants with jazz trios, and, you know, as background music. But because there were younger people involved, it wasn't, the music didn't have to be as subdued as it was previously when you had that scenario with a band, you know, a trio, you know, in a restaurant. Because now, as opposed to it being a fine dining restaurant, you know, it's a taco bar. You know, so it was a different dynamic, and I started to see a little bit more of that, which I was glad to see because I got gigs in those places. So both of those things were kind of going on simultaneously.
Was that when Cafe Nemo really started, or was that?
Cafe Nemo started then, yeah. Utopia started then. Where else was there? Dukem actually started to have some music during that time. So yeah, there was a lot. There was energy that was going on, but there was a downside to what was necessary to create that energy.
Where was that? Where did you see the gentrification really starting?
Oh, I wasn't familiar enough
Fair
with
enough.
the city to know. I just know that I was seeing more and more homeless people on the street as condos were being built.
When and how did you first come to play at Westminster?
Man, I can't even remember the first time I played here. I think I knew Dick Smith before Westminster started. And and I'm pretty sure he was involved with it from the very beginning.
Yeah.
But I knew him before it started, and when he started, I was I'm sure I was on his list of musicians to come in and play. I don't remember who I played with or when the first time was, but I played here probably 8 to 10 times a year at least, with different folks.
It's over 20 some years. That's over 200 times.
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, it's a bunch.
I meant to ask earlier. I mean, you got your degree in education. You said you're an educator. So while you're playing and you're touring and you're playing corporate gigs, are you working are you doing lessons? Are you working at a school, or how does that?
No, at that time I was primarily playing. I was given a few private lessons, but I was primarily playing. How I wound up doing what I'm doing now is I was playing with Stanley Turrentine. I worked with him for 5 years. Interesting sidebar. My very first gig with him was at the Blue Note. 5 years later, my last gig with him was at the Blue Note. He had a stroke. On the last night, he had a stroke and never made it to the gig. So that I found that an interesting
Parallel.
Yeah, that was very interesting. But anyway, so after he had a stroke, I went from having a nice gig, to having gone. So I'm still living here. In fact, he was living here at the time too. So I come back home, and it's like, okay, I got to make some money. And a friend of mine called me to sub for a gig for him at the convention center, the old convention center. And it was one of those kind of hurry up and wait, big production kind of things. You get there early and it's a whole long blah, 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 blah. You sit around and finally you get a chance to do your thing. All right, so it was one of those. And while I'm waiting, I struck up a conversation with, I think he was playing Barry on this gig, saxophone player, who was a band director at the Landon School in Bethesda. And, he's a saxophone player, loves Stanley, we talked about that. And he said, well, look, why don't you come out, he ran a program in which all the kids there have to take private lessons. He says, why don't you come out and just teach percussion, make some money to get you going. And that was about 21 years ago. And I taught, I was on their adjunct faculty for a while. And being on the adjunct, I could go, I could take 3 weeks to go wherever. So I did that. And then things started changing. I started actually liking the teaching part. I'd actually gone to school to be an educator. I had all my education stuff, and I knew how to play all the instruments. And so he tapped me to be his assistant director. Did that for 6 years. And 3 weeks before the COVID lockdown, he had a stroke. And all of a sudden, all of that comes to me. Everything gets locked down. Everything changes.
Yeah.
And so that's how I got to be where I am.
How did you begin to like and now really like the teaching aspect?
I didn't say I really liked it now. I didn't say that. Although I do, but for me, the thing I liked about it is, at the time, because it's changed now, which is why I'm not as happy as I was. At the time, it was a program that, even though it's kind of that school is an elite private school, there was a passion with the students towards what they did, and it was all about excellence. When they would perform, the first time I heard the band perform, I was really impressed with the level of musicality that they had. And it was because of this guy. His name is Earl Jackson, great band director. And I wanted to investigate that a little bit more. Not only the music, the attaining of the music quality, but the psychology behind what it takes to make a student decide to do that. All right, and that was what was interesting for me, is to see that and be a part of that, and put what I went to school to do to use, which I'd actually never done. I had the degree, but I'd never taught in that way. So I wanted to check it out, and look where it got me.
How has, I guess the way to phrase it, since Westminster, the jazz series started in '99, how has DC, how's the gigging landscape for a professional musician in the genre we call jazz, how has that changed?
It's just like this music, it's always evolving. It's always evolving. And it evolves kind of in peaks and valleys. And I've been through a couple of the peaks and a couple of the valleys. And the thing I like about this place is, other than the lockdown with the pandemic, this place has always been this place. Through all the peaks and valleys, clubs coming, clubs going, unfortunately musicians coming, musicians going. This place has been a constant. And the audience has been a constant as well. And by that, I don't mean the people, because like I said, people have been coming and people have been going. But I've seen over the course of time, the audience has changed, but the numbers really haven't. The numbers really haven't changed. There's still the same level of interest. There's still people who are aware and people who are open can see the beauty in this, even if they don't understand the music. The community that this place pushes out and welcomes in is if you're open to that, if you recognize that's pretty special. This is a pretty special place in terms of what Pastor Bryant and Dick Smith have been able to put together here. I know what's going on out there. I kind of know what the gigs are. Sometimes there's gigs, sometimes there's not gigs, but every Friday night I know what's going on here.
Why is that important?
It's important for a number of reasons. It's important from a selfish point of view, for a gig on a Friday night if I didn't have a gig on a Friday night. But more importantly it's important for the people that sit out there to know that this is here. It's important for what's presented here to be experienced by a new group of folks in this environment. It's important for the continuation of the sense of community that this place has, consistently. So yeah, it's important for a lot of reasons.
Do you think there's something about the music being presented here that gets deeper to that thing you were talking about, how the thing we call jazz is by nature a kind of spiritual practice?
Oh yeah.
In and of itself.
Oh yeah. I think that's a key component of it. And for me, it's for instance, this could never happen at my father's church. Because of the nature of that approach to spirituality and quite frankly, just religion, is not as open. So this couldn't happen at my father's church or a lot of different churches. Although there are some African American churches that are opening up to the spiritual side of it. My father never heard me play. He had plenty of opportunities. My father never heard me play jazz because the place that I was playing jazz served alcohol. He was not going in there. That's not where a preacher can't be in there. Unfortunately, he didn't have the opportunity to hear a jazz vespers or jazz being presented in a space like this. Because I think it would have given him a little more insight into why I do what I do. But I think the fact that it happens in this sacred space is an important component to why it's been able be what it's been for as long as it's been.
Do you have anything else that we didn't cover that you want to?
I just hope that this stays here another 27 years. Maybe not here, but exists for another however long it's been, because it's important. It's critical to both the continuation of what we do as well as the continuation of the audience that appreciates what we do.
All right. That's it.
Go.